Welcome back. Joshua sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. His hands trembled as he calculated the numbers for the third time that evening. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He had lost his job 2 months ago, and despite countless applications, nothing had materialized. His phone buzzed with another notification, probably another creditor. Joshua felt his heart race faster. The anxiety had become his constant companion, whispering worst-case scenarios in his mind every waking moment. He wondered how he would survive another week. That night, unable to sleep, Joshua remembered something his grandmother used to say before she passed. She would often quote Jesus saying, "Fear not," and would smile peacefully even during the hardest times. He had never understood how she maintained such calm in the face of difficulty. Desperate for anything that might bring relief, Joshua opened his laptop and searched for the meaning behind those words. He stumbled upon a lecture by Goldsmith about spiritual principles and the true nature of fear. Something about the title caught his attention, and he pressed play. The voice on the recording spoke with unusual authority and gentleness. Goldsmith explained that fear is not something to be fought or suppressed, but understood. Joshua leaned closer to the screen, his interest suddenly awakened despite his exhaustion. Goldsmith's words began to penetrate Joshua's consciousness. The teacher explained that when Jesus repeatedly said, "Fear not," he was not giving a command to simply stop being afraid. He was revealing a profound spiritual truth about the nature of reality itself. According to Goldsmith, Jesus understood that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from the divine source of all life. When we think we must rely solely on our own limited human resources, fear naturally arises. We fear lack, loss, disease, and death because we see ourselves as vulnerable and alone. Joshua paused the recording and sat back in his chair. This perspective was entirely different from anything he had heard in church growing up. He had always thought fear not meant he should try harder to be brave, that his fear was a personal failing or lack of faith. Goldsmith continued explaining that Jesus lived from a consciousness of oneness with God. From this awareness he could see that the things humans fear most have no real power. Material circumstances, though they appear threatening, cannot touch the eternal spiritual reality that is our true nature. The teacher's voice grew more emphatic as he described how Jesus performed miracles not through supernatural intervention, but through spiritual understanding. He saw through the illusion of separation and recognized the presence of God where others saw only problems and limitations. Over the following week, Joshua listened to the recording multiple times. Each time he discovered new layers of meaning. Goldsmith taught that fear is essentially a belief in two powers, God and something else that can harm us. But spiritual truth recognizes only one power, one presence. Joshua began to see how his fear had been rooted in the belief that his well-being depended entirely on external circumstances. His job, his bank account, other people's decisions. These had seemed like the source of his security. When they disappeared, terror filled the vacuum. But Goldsmith pointed to a different foundation. He explained that our true source is the infinite intelligence and love that created the universe. This source does not fluctuate with stock markets or employment trends. It is permanent, unchanging, and always available. The concept felt radical to Joshua. Could it really be true that his security did not depend on having a job or money in the bank? Everything in his practical experience seemed to contradict this idea. Yet something deep within him resonated with these words. Goldsmith addressed this exact doubt in his teaching. He acknowledged that spiritual principles seem impractical to the human mind, but he insisted that thousands of people throughout history had proven these truths by experience. When truly understood and lived, they produce tangible results in the material world. Joshua decided to test these principles in a small way. Instead of waking up and immediately diving into panic about his situation, he spent the first hour of each morning in quiet contemplation. He practiced recognizing the presence of divine intelligence within and around him. At first, his mind resisted fiercely. Thoughts of his dwindling bank account and mounting debt would intrude constantly, but he persisted, gently returning his attention to the truth that Goldsmith had illuminated. There is only one power, one source, and it is forever giving of itself. Something unexpected began to happen. The crushing weight of fear that had been his constant companion started to lift. Not all at once, but gradually. In moments of quiet awareness, Joshua experienced a peace he had never known, even when his circumstances had been comfortable. This peace was not the absence of challenges or the presence of solutions. It was something deeper, a sense of being held by something vast and loving. Joshua realized this was what his grandmother had possessed, that mysterious calm that no external circumstance could disturb. He remembered Goldsmith explaining that Jesus could sleep peacefully in a boat during a raging storm because he knew the truth about God's presence. The storm was real on one level, but it could not touch the deeper reality of divine order and love. 2 weeks into his daily practice, Joshua received a call from a former colleague named Robert. They had worked together years ago, and Robert had recently started his own consulting firm. He needed someone with Joshua's specific expertise for a major project. The timing seemed miraculous, but Joshua was beginning to understand what Goldsmith taught about divine timing. When we cease blocking the flow of good through fear and anxiety, when we become receptive to divine guidance, opportunities appear that were always there but invisible to our fear-clouded vision. Joshua accepted the project, but something had fundamentally shifted in him. He no longer felt desperate or grasping. The job was welcome, but his sense of security no longer depended on it. He had touched something deeper, more reliable than any external circumstance. As he worked on Robert's project, Joshua noticed he approached challenges differently. Where he once would have panicked at difficulties, he now paused to recognize the presence of infinite intelligence available to guide him. Solutions came more easily, creativity flowed more naturally. Goldsmith had taught that when we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we begin to live from a different consciousness. We stop trying to manipulate circumstances through anxiety and effort. Instead, we align ourselves with the divine flow that is always moving toward greater expression and fulfillment. Robert was so impressed with Joshua's work that he offered him a permanent position as a senior consultant. The salary was higher than his previous job, and the work was more aligned with his passions. But Joshua knew this was not the real miracle. The real miracle was the transformation of his consciousness. He had discovered that his grandmother's peace was not the result of having easy circumstances. It came from understanding a spiritual truth that transcended circumstances. Fear had lost its power over him because he no longer believed in its fundamental premise. Joshua continued his morning practice of recognizing divine presence. Goldsmith had emphasized that spiritual understanding is not a one-time achievement but a daily practice. Every day we must choose again to see through the illusion of separation and remember the truth of oneness. One morning during his contemplation, Joshua had a profound realization. He saw that every time Jesus said, "Fear not," he was inviting people to share his consciousness, his awareness of God's immediate presence. It was not a command, but an invitation to transformation. This understanding changed everything. Joshua was no longer trying to force himself to stop being afraid while still believing in all the reasons for fear. Instead, he was learning to see differently, to perceive the spiritual reality that exists beyond material appearances. Joshua began sharing his discovery with others who were struggling with fear and anxiety. He spoke carefully, knowing that these principles could sound like impractical mysticism to those who had not experienced their power. But to those who were ready, his words carried the ring of truth. He met Rebecca, a woman in her 42nd who was paralyzed by fear of a health diagnosis. She had been told she might have a serious illness and was waiting for test results. The fear was consuming her, making it impossible to function normally or find any peace. Joshua shared what he had learned from Goldsmith about the nature of fear and the meaning of fear not. He explained that Jesus was not telling her to be brave in the face of a real threat. He was revealing that the threat itself exists only in a limited perception of reality. Rebecca struggled to grasp this at first. Her body, the potential illness, the doctors and their tests all seemed undeniably real and threatening. How could spiritual truth possibly change these concrete facts? Joshua understood her confusion because he had felt the same way. He explained that spiritual understanding does not deny the appearance of problems. Instead, it sees beyond appearances to the underlying reality of divine perfection. When we align our consciousness with this truth, the appearance itself often changes, not through our will, but through divine law. Rebecca decided to try Joshua's approach while waiting for her test results. Each morning, instead of spiraling into fear scenarios, she spent time recognizing the presence of perfect life that is God. She acknowledged that her true being was spiritual, eternal, and untouchable by disease. The practice was difficult at first. Her mind kept returning to fear, analyzing symptoms, imagining worst outcomes. But gradually, like Joshua before her, she began to experience moments of profound peace. In these moments, she touched something real, something more substantial than her physical concerns. Goldsmith had taught that this peace is not escape or denial. It is the recognition of what is eternally true. Disease, lack, and danger exist in the realm of material appearance, but they have no existence in spiritual reality. As we dwell in spiritual awareness, material appearances come into alignment with spiritual truth. Rebecca's test results came back negative. There was no serious illness after all. But like Joshua with his job offer, she knew the real healing had already occurred. She had been healed of fear itself, of the belief that her life and well-being were at the mercy of material conditions. She called Joshua to thank him, her voice filled with emotion. She said she finally understood what Jesus meant by fear not. It was not a command to be brave, but a revelation that there is nothing to fear when we understand the true nature of reality and our relationship to God. If this message is resonating with you, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the spiritual insights that can transform your relationship with fear forever. Joshua's consulting work flourished, but he found himself increasingly drawn to share the spiritual principles that had transformed his life. He started a small study group focused on Goldsmith's teachings about fear, faith, and spiritual consciousness. The group met weekly in his apartment. People came from various backgrounds, each carrying their own burden of fear. Some feared financial ruin, others feared loss of loved ones, illness, failure, or loneliness. Despite their different circumstances, Joshua recognized they all suffered from the same fundamental misconception. They believed their well-being depended on external conditions remaining favorable. They believed they were separate from their source, vulnerable and alone in a threatening world. This belief is the root of all fear, and it is precisely what Jesus addressed when he repeatedly said, "Fear not." Joshua guided the group through Goldsmith's teaching systematically. They studied the idea that God is the only power, the only presence, the only life. Where God is, nothing else can be. Fear, disease, lack, and danger cannot exist in the presence of infinite good. At first, this sounded like positive thinking or wishful denial to some group members. But Joshua emphasized that Goldsmith was as not teaching affirmations or mental manipulation. He was pointing to an actual spiritual reality that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. A man named Christopher joined the group, bringing a particularly challenging situation. His teenage daughter had fallen into drug addiction, and despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation, she continued to relapse. Christopher's fear for her life was overwhelming and entirely understandable. He listened to the discussions about fear with barely concealed frustration. How could spiritual principles help when his daughter's life was genuinely at risk? This was not abstract philosophy, but a real emergency requiring real action. Joshua recognized the legitimacy of Christopher's concern, but Joshua also knew that fear itself was preventing Christopher from being truly helpful to his daughter. His terror kept him reactive, controlling, and unable to see clearly. Moreover, his fear was actually an unconscious agreement with the power of addiction, affirming its reality and strength. Goldsmith taught that to truly help anyone, we must first establish ourselves in spiritual truth. We must see beyond the appearance of the problem to the spiritual perfection that is always present. This is not denial, but the highest form of practical help we can offer. Christopher was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. Joshua suggested he spend time each day recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity, not the addict, not the troubled teenager, but the eternal spiritual being created in the image and likeness of God. Christopher committed to the practice, though doubt plagued him constantly. He would sit in meditation and try to see his daughter as God saw her, whole, perfect, and free. His human mind screamed that this was nonsense, that he was wasting time while she remained in danger. But gradually something shifted in Stouffer's consciousness. He began to experience a deep peace about his daughter, not because circumstances had changed, but because he had touched something eternal and unchangeable. He sensed her true being beneath the troubled surface appearance. This inner shift affected his interactions with his daughter profoundly. He stopped approaching her with fear and desperation. Instead, he related to her from a place of calm certainty about her fundamental goodness and worth. He no longer saw her as broken or damaged, but as temporarily confused about her true identity. His daughter noticed the change in her father immediately. The fear and disappointment she had always sensed in him had disappeared. In its place was something she had never experienced from him before, an unshakable confidence in her, despite all evidence to the contrary. Goldsmith explained that this is how spiritual healing works. When we stop empowering the problem through fear and see only the spiritual reality, we create an atmosphere in which healing can occur. We are not trying to change the person or condition, but recognizing what is eternally true. Over the following months, Christopher's daughter gradually turned away from drugs. It was not a sudden miracle, but a steady transformation. She later told her father that his change had been crucial. When he stopped being afraid for her, she stopped believing she was someone to be afraid of. The study group grew as people experienced the power of these principles in their own lives. Joshua realized that understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," was perhaps the most practical spiritual knowledge anyone could possess. It was not abstract theology, but a key to transformation in every area of life. He continued to study Goldsmith's works more deeply, discovering that this teacher had spent his entire life helping people understand the nature of spiritual consciousness. Goldsmith had experienced his own profound transformation and dedicated himself to sharing these truths with others. One teaching particularly struck Joshua. Goldsmith explained that Jesus never fought evil, disease, or lack. He simply failed to recognize them as real powers. He saw only God, only good, only spiritual perfection. This singular vision was the source of his power and peace. This was revolutionary for Joshua. He had spent his whole life fighting his fears, trying to overcome them through willpower or positive thinking. But Goldsmith taught a different way. Rather than fighting fear, we understand it has no foundation in spiritual reality. We see through it to the truth. Amanda, a schoolteacher, joined the group carrying years of anxiety about her own adequacy and worth. She constantly feared she was not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. This fear colored every interaction and decision in her life. Joshua introduced her to Goldsmith's teaching that we are not human beings trying to become spiritual. We are spiritual beings who have forgotten our true nature. Our worth is not earned through achievement or proven through performance. It is inherent in our existence as expressions of divine life. This idea was difficult for Amanda to accept. Her entire identity had been built around striving to prove her value. The suggestion that she was already complete, already worthy, already enough seemed too simple. Surely she had to do something to earn peace and self-acceptance. But Goldsmith taught that this very striving is what blocks us from experiencing our inherent wholeness. When we chase after what we already have, we perpetuate the illusion of lack. When we try to become what we already are, we deny our true identity. Amanda began practicing what Goldsmith called the art of meditation, which is simply resting in the awareness of God's presence, not trying to achieve anything or become anything, but recognizing what is already true. In these moments, her anxiety would dissolve, replaced by profound peace. The transformation in Amanda was remarkable. As she released her need to prove her worth, she became more effective as a teacher. Her students responded to her newfound calm and confidence. Parents commented on the positive change in her classroom atmosphere. She realized that her previous anxiety had actually made her less capable, not more. Fear had clouded her judgment, blocked her creativity, and exhausted her energy. By understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," she had accessed an inner resource that made her far more effective. Joshua watched these transformations with gratitude and wonder. He had stumbled upon Goldsmith's teaching in his own darkest moment, and it had changed everything. Now he was privileged to witness the same truth transforming others, each in their own unique way. The group studied Goldsmith's explanation of Jesus' statement, "My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives." The peace Jesus offered was not dependent on circumstances being favorable. It was the peace that comes from knowing the truth about God's presence and power. This peace was what Joshua's grandmother had possessed. It was what sustained Jesus in the boat during the storm. It was what enabled Christopher to remain calm about his daughter's struggle. It was a peace that transcended all understanding because it came from a dimension beyond human reasoning. Brian, a business executive, came to the group with a different kind of fear. He was terrified of failure, of losing his status and success. He worked constantly, driven by anxiety that if he relaxed for even a moment, everything would fall apart. His health was suffering, his marriage strained. Joshua shared Goldsmith's teaching that there is no spiritual law supporting failure or loss. Divine intelligence is always moving toward greater expression, greater good, greater fulfillment. When we align with this movement instead of trying to force outcomes through anxious effort, we work with spiritual law rather than against it. Brian found this counterintuitive. In his world, success came through aggressive action, constant vigilance, and competitive drive. The idea of relaxing into divine flow while trusting spiritual law seemed like a recipe for disaster. Yet he could not deny that his current approach was destroying him. He decided to experiment with a different way of working. Before each meeting or decision, he would take a moment to recognize divine intelligence present and available. He would affirm that the outcome was already established in spiritual reality, and his role was simply to be receptive to guidance. The results surprised him. His meetings became more productive, his decisions more sound. He felt a flow and ease he had never experienced. Most remarkably, his business results actually improved as he released the anxious striving that had dominated his professional life. If you're ready to learn more about living from this higher consciousness, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Brian shared his experience with the group, his voice filled with amazement. He said he had always thought fear was what kept him sharp and successful. He now realized fear had been his greatest handicap, limiting his vision and exhausting his resources. Joshua explained that this was precisely what Goldsmith meant when he taught about the principle of "my grace is sufficient." When we stop trying to accomplish everything through personal effort and instead become receptive to divine grace, we tap into an infinite resource. This grace is not something we must earn or deserve. It is the natural outpouring of divine love, always available, always sufficient for every need. Fear blocks our awareness of this grace, making us believe we must struggle alone with limited resources against overwhelming odds. The group discussed how prevalent this belief is in modern culture. We are taught that life is a struggle, that we must fight for everything, that only the strong and fearful enough to keep fighting will survive. This worldview guarantees perpetual anxiety and exhaustion. Jesus offered an entirely different paradigm. He lived from the consciousness that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that divine good is immediately available, that we need only recognize and receive what is already given. This is why he could say, "Fear not," with such confidence. Lisa, a retired nurse, brought a question that many in the group had been wondering. If spiritual truth is so powerful and fear is truly powerless, why do bad things still happen? Why do people still suffer despite faith and spiritual practice? Joshua acknowledged the legitimacy and importance of this question. He shared Goldsmith's teaching that we live in a world where most people operate from material consciousness, believing in multiple powers and accepting fear as natural. This collective consciousness creates much of the suffering we see. However, as individuals awaken to spiritual truth and establish themselves in the consciousness of God's presence, they begin to experience a different reality. They are not immune to all challenges, but they navigate them with peace and often see them transformed or resolved in unexpected ways. More importantly, their suffering changes in nature. Even when facing difficulties, they maintain an inner stability and peace that makes the experience entirely different. They know that no material circumstance can touch their true spiritual being or separate them from God's love. Goldsmith taught that Jesus himself faced persecution and crucifixion, yet he went through it without fear, maintaining his consciousness of oneness with God throughout. He demonstrated that even in the worst material circumstances, spiritual peace and power remain unshaken. The group continued meeting for months, and Joshua watched his lives transformed in remarkable ways. Not everyone's external circumstances changed dramatically, but everyone who committed to the practice experienced the lifting of fear's burden and the emergence of profound peace. He realized that this was Goldsmith's true gift to the world. The teacher had not promised that spiritual understanding would make life easy or problem-free. He had revealed something far more valuable, a way of living that transcends circumstances and remains unshaken regardless of appearances. Joshua began writing about his experience, hoping to reach others who were suffering under the weight of fear. He wrote about that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice explaining why Jesus said, "Fear not." He described the journey from terror to peace. The writing became a book which he self-published with no expectations, but people began finding it and sharing it with others. The message resonated because fear is perhaps the most universal human experience. Everyone knows its crushing weight and desperate seeks relief. Through emails and messages, Joshua heard story after story of lives transformed by understanding the spiritual principles Goldsmith had taught. People were discovering that fear loses its power when we understand it has no foundation in spiritual truth, when we recognize that God alone is power and presence. One message particularly moved Joshua. It was from a woman named Michelle, whose son had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. She had found Joshua book in her darkest hour and began applying Goldsmith's principles to her situation. She did not deny the medical diagnosis or refuse treatment, but she established herself in the spiritual truth that her son's eternal being was untouchable by disease. She recognized divine life as the only life, perfect and whole. She practiced seeing her son through God's eyes, not through the lens of fear. The shift in her consciousness affected the entire family. Where there had been despair and panic, peace emerged. Her son felt the change and responded to it. The medical team noticed something different in this family, a calm certainty that seemed to support the boy's healing process. Michelle's son went into remission, defying the doctor's predictions. But as she wrote to Joshua, the real miracle had been her liberation from fear. Even if circumstances had been different, she had discovered a peace that transcended outcomes, a foundation that no external event could shake. This was exactly what Goldsmith had taught. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we are not guaranteed specific material outcomes. We are given something infinitely more valuable, entrance into a consciousness where fear cannot exist because we know the truth about God's presence and power. Joshua reflected on his journey from that desperate night to this moment of helping others discover the same truth. He saw clearly now that his job loss and financial crisis had been essential to his awakening. Comfort had kept him spiritually asleep. Desperation had opened him to a deeper reality. This is often how spiritual awakening occurs. Goldsmith had explained, when material solutions fail and human resources are exhausted, we become receptive to spiritual truth. Crisis can be the doorway to transformation if we are willing to look beyond material appearances to spiritual reality. The study group had grown beyond Joshua's apartment, and they now met in a rented space. New people arrived each week, each carrying their own burden of fear. Joshua welcomed them, knowing they were about to discover what he had discovered, a truth that would change everything. He always began with new members the same way, sharing his own story and then explaining Goldsmith's core teaching. When Jesus said, "Fear not," he was revealing that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from God, dependent on material circumstances, vulnerable to countless threatening powers. But spiritual truth knows only one power, one presence, one life. In the awareness of this truth, fear dissolves because its foundation disappears. We are not alone, not vulnerable, not dependent on material conditions for our well-being. We are eternal spiritual beings, forever held in divine love. Timothy arrived at the group in crisis. His marriage was ending, his business failing, his health deteriorating. He felt like everything in his life was collapsing simultaneously. The fear was so intense he could barely function, and he came to the group as a last resort. Joshua recognized the desperation because he had been there himself. He knew that Timothy was actually in the perfect position to discover spiritual truth because his reliance on material solutions was completely exhausted. There was nowhere to turn but inward to the only source that never fails. Over the following weeks, Timothy learned to practice what Goldsmith called the tabernacle within. Several times each day, he would withdraw from appearances and dwell in the awareness of God's presence. He would recognize that despite all appearances to the contrary, divine order was establishing itself in his life. At first, this seemed like futile escapism while his world burned around him. But gradually, Timothy began to experience what Joshua and others had discovered. A deep peace emerged entirely independent of his circumstances. In that peace, clarity and wisdom arose, where before there had been only panic. Goldsmith had taught that this inner peace is not passive acceptance, but the most powerful force in the universe. It is the atmosphere in which divine intelligence can work, in which solutions can appear, in which transformation becomes possible. Fear blocks this process while peace enables it. Timothy's external circumstances did not all resolve immediately or easily. His marriage did end, though, with far less acrimony than expected. His business required restructuring, but he found creative solutions he would never have seen through the fog of fear. His health began improving as stress decreased. More importantly, Timothy discovered that his sense of well-being no longer depended on any of these external factors. He had found something that could not be taken away, could not fail, could not disappoint. He had discovered his true foundation in spiritual reality. This was the ultimate meaning of Jesus' words, "Fear not." Not a command to suppress natural human emotions, but an invitation to discover the consciousness Jesus himself lived from. A consciousness where fear is impossible because we know ourselves to be inseparable from infinite good. The study group had become a community of people who had made this discovery. They came from different circumstances and backgrounds, but they shared a common experience. They had touched something real, something that transcended all material conditions, something that brought genuine peace. Joshua often thought about Goldsmith and the gift he had given the world. The teacher had spent his life illuminating these spiritual principles, helping people understand the practical implications of spiritual truth. His words had reached across time to save Joshua in his darkest hour. Years passed and Joshua continued sharing what he had learned. His book reached more people. The study group continued to grow and lives kept transforming. But he never lost sight of the simple truth at the heart of everything, the truth that had saved him. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we discover that fear is not overcome through courage or willpower. It dissolves through understanding. When we see clearly that God alone is power and presence, when we know ourselves to be inseparable from this infinite source, fear has no place to exist. This understanding must be renewed daily because the material world constantly contradicts it. Appearances suggest we are vulnerable, separate, dependent on favorable circumstances. The news, our bank accounts, our bodies, other people's opinions, all seem to confirm the reality of threat and danger. But spiritual truth remains unchanged by appearances. God is still, the only power, still completely present, still expressing as infinite good. Our work is to remember this truth, to dwell in this awareness, to see from this consciousness, rather than from the consciousness of fear. Joshua had discovered that this practice was not escape from reality, but engagement with true reality. The material world of appearances is the illusion. Spiritual truth is the reality. As we dwell in spiritual truth, even the appearance begins to reflect more harmony, more good, more of what we have always sought. On the anniversary of that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice, Joshua sat in quiet gratitude. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this truth, all the fear that had been lifted, all the peace that had been discovered. He understood now that his grandmother's peace had not been mysterious or unattainable. She had simply understood what Jesus meant by fear not. She had lived from the consciousness of God's presence, and that consciousness had sustained her through every circumstance. This same peace was available to everyone, not through special gifts or exceptional holiness, but through simple understanding. When we grasp that we are not separate from our source, that divine intelligence and love are always present and available, fear loses its foundation and power. Joshua looked at the group gathering for their weekly meeting. New faces mixed with familiar ones, all seeking the same thing, relief from fear's crushing weight. He knew that each person who truly understood these principles would go on to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of peace. This was Goldsmith's legacy and Jesus' gift to humanity, not a religion or philosophy to believe in, but a truth to be experienced. A truth that sets us free from fear and establishes us in the consciousness of infinite good. A truth that transforms everything when we finally understand why Jesus said, "Fear not." In that understanding lies the peace that surpasses all human comprehension. The peace that is our true nature and eternal inheritance. If this teaching has touched your heart, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment sharing your experience with fear and join our community of spiritual seekers discovering the peace that Jesus promised. Thanks for watching.